Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to start talking about organic molecules that we find in the body. Remember that when we talk about organic molecules, the most important characteristic of them is that they have carbon in them. Because we're using carbon and not some of those other compounds like we saw with acids and bases or with our salts, because of that, we use organic compounds we build organic compounds with covalent bonds. Covalent bonds, remember, are strong bonds. They don't easily fall apart. So building an organic compound with these covalent bonds is going to mean it stays together much better. Most of our, or all of our organic molecules that we're going to talk about today have two forms. There's the large macromolecule, which is the big form of them. But that big form came from what we might call micromolecules or monomers, small pieces. Let me give you some examples to help this make sense. When we're talking about a storage molecule inside the body called glycogen, glycogen is the polymer form of many glucose molecules, monomers, that are attached to each other with covalent bonds. We also see this with proteins. Proteins are my polymer form that I built by stitching together many amino acids. So, when we're thinking about all of these organic compounds, keep that frame of reference in mind. We build carbohydrates with things like glucose, a monosaccharide. We build proteins with amino acids. All of this talk of building and breaking, it's the same kind of chemical reactions that we talked about before. So when we're building glycogen, when we're building proteins, this is that process called dehydration synthesis. Dehydration synthesis means I pull water out to build a new bond. And just like we talked about, if I can do dehydration synthesis with it, I can also do hydrolysis. Remember, hydrolysis was a form of decomposition reaction where I take a chemical bond, add water across it, and it's broken into pieces. So, as we consider our monomers and our polymers, remember that we build polymers with dehydration synthesis, and we break them back down with hydrolysis. So let's talk about our first group of organic compounds. The first group of organic compounds are called carbohydrates, and literally their name tells me what they are. Carbohydrates are hydrated carbons. So when we look at the structure of a carbohydrate, you'll see lots of carbon atoms inside of it, and you'll also see hydrogens and oxygens. Present at the ratio, we see them in water, so 2 hydrogens to every 1 oxygen. Carbohydrates. In general, whenever we think about carbohydrates, the first thing I want you to think of is quick, easily accessible energy. Now, I want you to underline, highlight, star, accessible. The big thing about carbohydrates is this form of energy is really easy for your body to use. We can have other kinds of energy. We'll talk about in a moment lipids. There's a lot of energy in those, but they're not very accessible. So, carbohydrates we use to build energy fast. It's very accessible. A couple other places that we'll see carbohydrates are when we talk about the DNA and the RNA inside your body. DNA, deoxyribose sugar. RNA, is ribonucleic acid that has ribose sugar in it. We also see carbohydrates functioning as a name tag or a label on the outside of your cells. So we'll come back to this in the next chapter. When we talk about carbohydrates, there are different forms of them, but it all comes down to their size. So some of our common carbohydrates that we think about in the body are monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, you are probably very familiar with glucose. So glucose is a one sugar. It exists by itself. And those other sugars I mentioned in DNA, deoxyribose, and RNA, ribose, each of these by themselves is what we call a monosaccharide. When I start putting together a couple of monosaccharides, I make what's called a disaccharide. So my small polymer is a disaccharide. If we look at some of these examples, we can put glucose and fructose together. That makes sucrose, a disaccharide. Sucrose, by the way, is what we know as table sugar, or the lactose sugar. That's a monosaccharide galactose connected to another monosaccharide, glucose. So monosaccharides, one piece, disaccharides, two pieces. But we also have what are known as polysaccharides. Polysaccharides mean we have more than one or two sugar that are all stored together. The most common one in humans is what we call glycogen. So glycogen, as we'll talk about with muscle contraction, is a way for us to short-term store some energy. Because remember, carbohydrates are accessible energy. In plants, we don't see the molecule glycogen, we see the molecule starch. So starch is the way that plants will hook together all of their glucose molecules. Notice that we see a branching pattern in glycogen, whereas in starch, it's lots of long straight lines. So because of this, we access that energy a little bit differently. One other polysaccharide to mention is the polysaccharide cellulose. When we talk about cellulose, this is the kind of carbohydrate that we find inside plant cell walls, giving them their structure. Interestingly, this is a form of carbohydrate that humans aren't able to break down on their own. This is why we use things like gut bacteria to help us process that salad that we ate for lunch. So, we've talked about our first kind of organic molecule in the body, the carbohydrates. Biggest picture function, fast energy that's easily accessible. Also helpful though in cell walls or in storing that energy.